Hello everyone, my name is Molly. Thank you so much for having me here today. First things first, I just want to say I am on Twitter, so if throughout the presentation you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out. And my Twitter handle is Molly What Talks, also on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, all the rest of it, but Twitter is my favorite mode of contact. So hopefully what I have to say will be of interest, will inspire, motivate, and just change perspectives. Without further ado, let me just introduce myself. So I am, let me see if I can just move this so that we can see. There we go. So I am an accessibility and user experience UX consultant at my own company called Molly What Talks that was founded about 4 or 5 years ago now. And it's mainly through a result of my own life experiences and kind of this growing passion of mine to create fully accessible and inclusive experiences. This will make a little bit more sense in a few moments when I explain why. But I also have a part-time role at a company called Nexa Digital, which is part of a bigger group called Nexa Group, which is actually a Swedish company. And it's all human end user experience. So we're all very, very passionate about human-centered design, and accessibility plays a big part in that. So I run lots of workshops, audits, and so on to help clients, customers understand what they're doing wrong and kind of guide them in the right sort of direction. So what does this mean to me, and why am I so passionate about it? So this is a favorite quote of mine, which I can't claim as my own, but it just resonates with me so much, and I use it in almost all of my presentations. And that is, no one understands inclusion like those who have been excluded. Now, I have been excluded, as I mentioned, as a result of a series of life experiences. That's why I'm so passionate about inclusion and accessibility. And that started with being born deaf. So my parents didn't actually discover I was deaf until I was 18 months old. I had 2 older siblings that liked to talk for me a lot of the time, which is very normal. I was incredibly visual, and I really enjoyed like cartoons and Tom and Jerry, things like that didn't have much sound. But my parents started to notice something wasn't quite right when they would walk into the room and call my name and I wouldn't move or look around or anything. So through parents' intuition and my GP, we got audiology appointments and so on, and it was confirmed I had a severe hearing loss at 18 months old. So as I just mentioned, life quickly revolved around accessibility. How was Molly going to be able to access life, let alone the classroom, friendship groups, getting a job, getting to university, all of these things that everyone experiences? But for Molly, it was how was she going to be able to do this? And that meant looking at ways of accessing content, materials, and communication. So with that, I had my hearing aids. I had hearing aids from 18 months old, and the hearing aids worked just fine with speech therapists. I didn't like my hearing aids to begin with because what 18-month-old wanted funny things in their ears. But other than that, I soon realized I needed them in order to communicate. And as I said, I had a super happy childhood. I was just Molly with the hearing aids, and it never bothered me. However, I'd like to say it all ended there. However, I got to 11 or 12 and I was experiencing some more challenges, and not the hormonal type, not just that, I was hormonal. So in the classroom, I was really struggling to lip read, to see the board in the classroom. I was clumsier, and I was struggling with kind of new faces and lots of headaches. And so it's actually my teacher of the deaf at the time who said, Molly, I think you need reading glasses. It's not unusual for deaf children and adults to experience such exhaustion because everything is so visual, from lip patterns to gestures, some BSL, British Sign Language, everything is consumed by the eyes. So it's incredibly exhausting. Glasses will probably help resolve this. So I went for a routine eye check. And I was very fortunate because my optician had been reading up on this condition and has said to my parents, do you know why Molly is deaf? They said, no, we were just told it was technical blip, nothing else, no family history, etc. And he said, I think there's something not quite right at the back of Molly's eyes, and I think it's linked to her deafness. So that's when I got diagnosed with Usher syndrome. Now, Usher syndrome is a combination of deafness and acquired blindness. It's actually the most common cause of congenital deaf blindness. It's one of those invisible disabilities that not many people with Usher feel comfortable talking about because it's not widely accepted, unfortunately, because it is an invisible disability. It's really hard to explain yourself all the time. The thing about retinitis pigmentosa / RP on its own is also very common. And it's the most common cause of progressive blindness. So you're born fully sighted, and then you lose your peripheral vision and you get like tunnel-like vision. The rate of progression and how much the person loses depends on the person. I went from being partially sighted at the age of 12 to severely sight impaired, which is politically correct for blind at the age of 14. So following on from that, so from the how, being a deaf-blind person, how was I going to access materials, content, communication, inclusion? All of these features shown on the screen now are built-in accessibility features, which you may or may not be aware of already. Android have them as well. So every handheld device and product will have accessibility features now, which is great, but not everybody is totally aware of them and is aware of how to use them. But here's a series of features. So you've got color filters, which is great. So you can enable like a tint on the screen, which will reduce the glare and sharpen the text. There's also a screen reader called VoiceOver, which is a navigational speaking tool for someone who has no useful vision to be able to browse the web and do certain tasks. You can also invert the colors. You have dark and light mode. Apple recognized this as being a pretty mainstream feature that everyone benefited from, opposed to just visually impaired people. So now this is now brought up in the setup process using an iPhone. When you first set up, it'll ask you if you want large text. It'll ask you if you want dark or light mode. A lot of people just see this as a preference, and it is, but at the same time, it's also an accessibility feature, which is great. So that's enabling inclusion. So yeah, again, you can change text size, display, and audio descriptions. All of these things are widely used now, and it is at no extra cost of assistive tech and things like that. Because stereotypically, people do think people with disabilities use really expensive assistive technology, which ironically is not very accessible because it's so expensive. For blind people particularly, it's really common for you to be unemployed, and really people that use JAWS, for example, mostly it gets funded by an employer, which of course, if you're unemployed, that's not an option. So the Apple Watch is also another tool that I use for navigation through the prominent haptics that are there. So when I receive text, when I have navigational maps on, it vibrates on my wrist and tells me through my hearing aids whether to go left or right. This is a brilliant piece of kit that really enables me to be more independent with my guide dog also. My guide dog Bella is brilliant at getting me from A to B safely, but contrary to what people believe, guide dogs do not have a built-in sat-nav in their brains. So the technology that is available out there can really help fill that gap. So the maps is telling us where to go. I command Bella and Bella gets me there safely. So this whole package works really well for me to travel the world and do the work that I do today. So we always did think with the right tools, I would succeed, whatever. However, it wasn't so much about the tools. It was actually about the lack of awareness and misconceptions that I experienced growing up. So I did get to university. I had my toolkit, had all the tools that I just mentioned. However, reading tools, the internet, etc., none of them worked with my assistive technology. And so therefore I was 10 steps forward, 20 steps back. And this is infuriating because I felt so successful having got to university, having been told by teachers and people growing up that I wouldn't get this far. I got into university, but then I couldn't access it. And this wasn't because of the technology, although the design put in place was inaccessible, but it was more because of the lack of awareness and understanding. And I wasn't expecting people to be professionals on Usher syndrome or disability in general, but they weren't open-minded, they didn't listen to me, and they didn't ask the right questions. So it took me about 4 or 5 months before I actually decided to withdraw from university, which was really, really unfortunate, but thankfully I found my niche, and I set up my company, and here I am today. But ultimately, I want to prevent these experiences from happening. But tools that did help, so you got Kindles because you can change text size, iPad, all of the features I mentioned in my MacBook as well. Flatmates, the people that I worked with, so actual individuals that were there supporting me on a daily basis, made all the difference. So I mentioned why I didn't stay, but these were the things. My tech did help, but it wasn't enough, and my flatmates did help, but it wasn't enough. It was the whole constitution that really pushed me away, and stopped me from feeling welcome. So my biggest downfalls have been due to misunderstanding. So it's so important to understand and consider the grey areas. Assistive technology is not a cure, but a tool to help assist. So it's so important to not assume that just because this person got all the technology and uses the tech really, really well, which the next person might not, but just because of that does not mean that that's a be all end all. Absolutely not. So it's all about creating materials, products and services to work with various tools, working with those users that use these tools, and to enable that more inclusion. It's so important to recognize that this is not an overnight fix, and you will not always please everyone. We all just have to start somewhere and listening. So here are some common misconceptions that I've experienced, and as a result, the design has not been put in place for people like myself, because people are designing with stereotypes in mind. So these are a couple of stereotypes that I've experienced. So I'm registered blind, but I do not use a screen reader, I do not use Braille, and I do have some useful vision. Now this always surprises people, because people think, oh my goodness, you're blind and you can't see anything and you don't use voiceover. And it's like, well, no, actually I do have some useful vision. There are many other on-screen navigational tools that I use with my useful vision, as well as speaking tools. So it's very, very important to understand that it's not black and white. The grey areas are massive. But how do blind people read? So every visually impaired, blind, low vision individual has their own way of accessing content. So yes, there's Braille, it's all audiobooks, but did you know 93% of blind people do actually see something? So everything is a spectrum. So understanding that is a very good start. So following on from that, what I find quite interesting from a design perspective is when thinking about accessibility into inclusion, glasses are everywhere. Everyone's wearing glasses. And statistically, it says 1 in 4 of us will need glasses by the age of 40. Now, glasses are a form of assistive technology because they help assist you access content. So therefore, you have got accessibility needs. Now, there's this common stereotype that when you say accessibility, people think that automatically means disability. And so therefore, this whole big grey area of people that actually are using assistive tech to access text are forgotten about. So a simple feature like large text is not widely accommodated in apps and services and products. So in Apple, in the settings, it says apps that support dynamic type will adjust to your preferred reading size. Now, that makes so much sense, right? But why doesn't it mean that when I go into my app store and I install apps, that more often than not, the text size is not my preferred reading size? And that is because the implementation of the dynamic type hasn't been enabled, and so it doesn't read it. So you know, there's lots of apps, more apps so more apps don't use it than they do. And that's what's really, really infuriating when you think just how many people would benefit from this. An example of this, I'm registered blind. I have my text size smaller than my parents do. They are both sighted individuals that wear glasses, but they have their text size larger. And the only difference being they're in their late 50s, and it's, you know, that's just what happens as everybody gets older. Here's an illustration of what I see. So again, just trying to break down those stereotypes around what blind people see and don't see, because there are a lot of Chrome extensions now you can get that kind of apply like a filter template to your screen to kind of empathize with users that have low vision or tunnel vision or cataracts, etc., which are great, but they're not 100% realistic, and it's so important to understand that. So I think one called Chrome Lens, something like that. There's a few that do them, and they're worth knowing about. So when you're trying to look at a website and understand some of the challenges, great, but it's also really important to understand that it's not 100% realistic. It's not rigid black round in the corners, in the peripherals for RP. As illustrated here, there's lots of flickering light, and there's actually, I can see bits like I have blind spots in my peripherals, but it's not particularly useful. And then in the middle, amongst all the flashing and stuff, my vision is actually really good. You know, I can read small text, but as you can imagine, I'm scanning around a lot. So if you've got flashing pop-ups or modals and things like that, they're easily missed, or poor contrast can easily be misread. And, you know, again, I would get trapped in a website and I would lose what I'm doing, and I wouldn't be able to fulfill a task that I'm trying to do. So hopefully that gives you more of an idea of, you know, how complex being visually impaired can be. So here is an example of a good example of accessing text online using tools that work well. So pinch zoom, everyone uses pinch zoom. Normally, if I'm in a room of people, I ask people who uses pinch zoom. 9 times out of 10, everyone puts their hands up, and people that don't, they're lying, because everyone uses pinch zoom. And how annoying or frustrating when that doesn't work. But BBC do a really great job of working with the tools that I use. So one being pinch zoom, reader view, which you'll notice when I play it, some of you might have heard of it already, but it basically reduces all the clutter and it goes to that contrast mode that I prefer, that I've set up in my settings. So it's dark mode with white text, very clear, no pictures, just text. And if my eyes are having a good day, I would just read that text. But if not, I would use speak screen, which would then read the content from top to bottom. So I'm just going to play this clip, and hopefully this will, you know, work. I'm picking a random article here because none of this really interests me, but I'm zooming in to find a random article. And I've enabled reader view, and it's got that nice clip.
BBC Sport, News and Live scores, BBC Media Applications Technologies Limited, 4.5 stars, get, on the App Store, Premier League predictions, Lero v singer-songwriter Amy McDonald.
So what's great is a speak screen is a very straightforward screen reader. It's very different to VoiceOver, which is more navigational, and it will explain where your toolbar is, where your home button is, the orientation of your screen. This isn't as descriptive of that, is literally just content up to down. It also highlights what's being said at one time, which is great if you've got some useful vision. Speak screen was actually initially designed for people with cognitive impairments, so just things to be read out to you. It's a lot easier to access text that way. To begin with, there's a little toolbar as well that came up that said play, pause, slow down, speed up, or exit. So a very simplistic toolbar that will that are basically just basic settings for speak screen as well. So if I wanted to change the voice, if I wanted to slow it down or speed it up, I could do that with ease. So really, really good user experience using speak screen. So if I just continue.
Premier League, Lero's predictions. Manchester City have won their past 3 home league games against Liverpool with an aggregate score of 11-1. Can they make it full?
So I've stopped it now, and now I'm showing that you can change the settings of the reader view. So change contrast depending on preference, and you can enlarge and reduce text size. Really, really great stuff. And as you do this, the text stays within your window, which is brilliant. Often when you go to a website that's poorly designed and you zoom in, the text falls off the screen. And so what I would do as a last resort is I would use this zoom feature, which is an iOS zoom. But as you can see here, it's a lot of scanning. It's very long-winded and it's exhausting. So whilst it's great to have that as a last resort, it's something that I would prefer not to rely on. But BBC do this really well, so I wouldn't actually need to use that zoom feature. Cool. So recognize that every user is different and sometimes in a lot of ways similar. So of course, this doesn't make people's job any easier when wanting to design accessible, inclusive products, because it's not like a checklist or anything like that. There are checklists that you can look around for, but it's really important that you understand that this is not the be all end all, that actually we are designing for people. So, you know, we're all different and we're all similar, just like humanity in general, right? But let's talk figures quickly. I know I'm running out of time. 1 billion people are living with a long-term disability worldwide. Arguably, this number is a lot larger. So when thinking about accessibility and who benefits from accessibility, we're not necessarily thinking about disability. So actually, this figure is bigger when thinking about accessibility, but also the people that have been undiagnosed are waiting for diagnosis, people that don't identify as having a disability, people living with impairments that aren't classed as disabilities. So many more people than a billion. And now a billion people is already a lot of people, and it already merits enough, you know, for us to really know that it's important enough to design for accessibility, but just understand, arguably, this number is way bigger. So in the UK, it's around 22% of people have a form of disability. In Sweden, around 20%. This is really just to gauge an idea. In Europe, it is mainly 20% in each country in Europe. And even in the States, you're looking at around 20% as well, which is quite a big number. But as I said, pretty sure it's larger. And of course, a lot of these challenges have gone up substantially as a result of COVID-19. People working from home and obviously having to resort to their tools. I found, because I'm a bit of a pro with my tools, I was all right with it, but it really brought to light how many people had tools but didn't know how to use them, and the workplace is not knowing how to help the individuals cater to that. So that was really interesting. But now actually we've come around to more of an inclusive setting where there's hybrid work, and people with disabilities can work from home with tools that are provided. And this is really great because it does enable connection, as well as with family members, but with colleagues as well. It's kind of more normalized, people working from home, and it prevents that sense of isolation. But as you can imagine, for other people, it has really increased their sense of isolation. And so mental health with that has been really quite tricky. So the big question is how, but not so much how. Why do people get it wrong? I think I've pretty much touched on that, to be honest. But I mentioned checklists. So WCAG is a great place to start in the world of design development. WCAG 2.1, 2.2 is a great sort of resource to use and apply to your website or whatever. As I mentioned before, though, it's not the start. It is a starting point, but it's not where you end. There's a lot of things that even WCAG won't pick up on that will say it passes, but actually with manual testing, it fails. So it's so important to understand that a lot of manual testing, so involving users like myself to test it properly, would enable further accessibility and better design. A quick tip, so without going too technical, because honestly, I've tried to do a combination of presentations in one in very small time, but a tab key. I know a lot of people use the tab key, and the tab key, if it doesn't work, is incredibly frustrating. So again, if I was in a room full of people, I would ask who uses a tab key. More often than not, most of the room hands go up. When you're filling in a form, you tab instead of using the mouse, you just tab to tab through a form. How annoying is it when that doesn't work? And that's when a lot of people go, yeah, it's so annoying. So a quick tip, really, most assistive technologies, if not all of them, rely on the keyboard alone, and the tab key is incredibly important for navigation. Assure that your websites work with the tab key. The tab key accesses all the elements on the page, all the interactive elements, all the buttons, etc. Make sure all of this is fully accessible with the tab key. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, in my opinion, checklists don't work. They don't work on their own, is what I mean. But nothing in life is black and white, let alone in today's society, growing diverse society of end users. It is like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. And this is why many people get it wrong. This is an example. So what is wrong with this picture? So I'd normally ask people this, but it is basically a label that says door locked when lit, and push to lock door when lit, and push to close door when lit. And then underneath, in case you can't see, there are some braille. So braille in what is in text. So in case you hadn't already figured out, if you are a braille user, it's unlikely that you have any useful vision. So you'd be reading that and it says door locked when lit. This individual would not be able to see when the door is lit. This is incredible, the fact that it actually exists. It actually doesn't, they stopped running it. Now, it was on Virgin trains, they stopped doing this now, which is great, but there are still many experiences like this because organizations, companies have gone, right, we need to make sure all our written content is accessible, let's put braille on all of it, tick. And they've not understood that actually there are more, that there needs to be more consideration into the end user experience where braille is concerned. And also you're forgetting the 93% of blind people that don't necessarily rely on braille. So you've only catered really for the 7%, but actually then you haven't even thought it through for the 7% of blind people. So users must be involved in testing for products for general usability. A lot of accessibility issues fall into usability problems, which usually means easy fixes. But actually, if you want a low expense or a way of saving money, the idea would be to implement all of this right from the very beginning. Think about accessibility right at the very beginning and inclusion, and don't leave it to the very end, because more often than not, you'll have to go back, redo things, and it'll cost more money. Nobody wants that. So just start thinking differently from start to finish, have users involved all the way through, and prevent these mistakes. Because people like myself who rely on technology the most, perhaps the most, are still often excluded to this. So thinking back to my university experience, it was great, I had all my tools, but the place that I was at and the people that were there and the design that they had in place did not work with my tools. So we're still often excluded. So it's a way of joining the dots and trying to enable that further inclusion by just changing your perspective. How do we think differently? Think of yourself. So what about you in 20 years' time, or about your parents, your grandparents? Are they navigating the world a bit differently now? But what doesn't change? Guaranteed, you will still be using your handheld devices. So your mobile phone, for instance, that's something we'll still use. And you'll still want to do stuff, basically. You'll still want to book holidays. You'll still want to ring your parents, your grandchildren, etc. You'll still want to use these things. The only thing that will change is how you do these things, how you access things. So that's why we need to really start implementing simple things like large text, contrast changing, color filters, easy changes that users in our aging population can use and still feel included and not excluded. And arguably, this would probably help a lot of the pride, because they don't necessarily want to ask for help. A lot of them, I'm not stereotyping, but a lot of, like my granddad, would not want to ask for help. They still want to do it their own. They'd want to do the food shopping on their own. So I helped him set up the Asda app on his iPad, and he now does his shopping himself rather than asking my cousins to go and get it for him. So it's that sense of independence. But that's why it's so important to consider accessibility, not just for the minorities, but the majorities. So as I just explained, our aging population, so important. Let's think about the majorities rather than the minorities. Let's not stereotype and think that all disabled people are black and white. There's actually lots of grey areas. And by then, we're thinking about the majority of us that will experience at some point in our lives some kind of accessibility, or will feel excluded for whatever reason. So let's not leave anybody behind. So the minorities, of course, come with us, but let's start thinking about the majority and how we can use these unique capabilities rather than disabilities. because when we get it right, it's invisible. Volume is one of these that every single one of us uses now. And this was the first, it wasn't the first, but it's one of the ones that I think many people just overlook now, but it's something that we change depending on our environment and the people we're with. Granddad can't hear the telly, we'd higher it up. Granddad's snoozing on the sofa, we lower it down. We've changed it, we've altered it to our environment to access it, to have a more pleasant experience. So that's what I'm trying to say. When we get it right, it's invisible. Thank you so much for listening. And as I said, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me on Twitter, or I do have a website, Molly Watt Talks, mollywatt.com. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.